Let me start by just telling you my story in the sense of the church here, how I got here and right to this particular place today. My dad was in the Navy for 22 years, retired when I was 12, and by then I had been in 16 schools. Let's see, no, the other way around. We moved 16 times. I was in 23 schools, changed schools several times between moves, and so that was a big part of my life in the sense of my upbringing. And when I was 12, we got the first farm, and my desire was to be a farmer. That's all I ever wanted to do. I went to college when I graduated from high school in 1967 because in Trout Lake there were 12 girls in the entire high school. That's how big the school was, and I had dated all of them a number of times and didn't want to marry any of them. And so I was in a dilemma. I didn't know where to. I asked my pastor what I should do, and he said, well, go to a Christian college. You can find a wife there. So that's why I went to college, to find a wife. And so it took me 2 years, and when I found my wife and we got married, then I came back to the farm. And we farmed for a number of years, Darien with my father, and then decided to come back and finish my schooling. I went 2 years, and they told me I needed a Christian service assignment. That was part of the schooling, the education requirement, and so the general director for the Conservative Baptist was then in Salem, and Dr. Losi was his name, and I went and said, I need a Christian service assignment, and the church I grew up in Trout Lake is a really little church, and so I'd like to find a really little church in the area. And he said, well, they're going to start a church in Jefferson in a couple of months, and if you'd like, you can plug in there. And I said, well, that'd be great. And it was Bart Marshall was a pastor in Salem, and he was going to start this church. And so I was at the first service. My wife and I, we didn't have any kids, and we met up here in town in the concert hall, and we went a couple of years, and then I graduated in 75, went back to the dairy, and was going to settle down and farm for the rest of my life. And we had our first child. We'd been married 6 years. Doctor told us we had about a 1 in 10,000 chance of having children, and so that was a great miracle. And so I graduated from college, had a baby, went back to the farm. Everything I ever wanted, I had. And so we farmed for about a year and a half. Patty was going to go down and visit her parents in the Bay Area, and we didn't have a lot of money, so she was going to take the train. We drove to Portland, which Trout Lake is north of Hood River, right at the base of Mount Adams. It's about a 90-minute drive to Portland, and we were late just by about 60 seconds. The train was just pulling out. And the guy there, the conductor or whatever, whoever he sold the tickets, he says, you know, you could drive, if you drive 70 miles an hour, you can beat the train to Salem. Now, I had a 1960 Volkswagen, and floorboarded, it would go 72, as long as you weren't going up a hill. And so we took off, drove as fast as my car would go down Salem, pulled into the train thing, followed the signs off the freeway, pulled right in. Just as it was pulling in, Patty jumped out of the car, grabbed her suitcase, and she ran, jumped on the train, and away she went. And so I was in Salem. I thought, I'm this close, I might as well drive down to Jefferson and see how things are going. Been a year and a half, drove in to one of the farmers that was going to church, one of the deacons in the church. We talked about farming and price of wheat and all that kind of good stuff. I asked how the church was going, and he says, well, the pastor who started the church resigned. He's going back to seminary, and things aren't going real well, and on and on. And I said, that was too bad. Walked out the door, ready to go back home, and as I walked out the door, he said, you know, you should come back and be our pastor. I laughed out loud. I said, yeah, right. I was, or I guess I should say I am, the most anti-social, introverted individual God has ever made. My basic philosophy is that cows are considerably easier to get along with than people, a whole lot easier to work with. But it was something about the way he said it. I don't know what it was. God just didn't let me get rid of it. And so for the next number of months, I just struggled big time with this thing. And finally, I had gone to a seminar where the speaker said, if you really want to know God's will, you need to get your father's counsel. Well, my dad, I knew what he would say. One of his favorite words was foolishness. Girls were foolishness, cars were foolishness, anything but work was foolishness. And so I thought, I'm going to ask my dad. And I could hear him say it. When I said, Dad, what do you think? Should I walk away from this dairy and go be a pastor? And he'd say, foolishness. So one day I asked, we were leaning against the fence looking out, the heifers trying to decide which one was going to calf next, and I said, Dad, They want me to come down and be a pastor of a church of 12 people that doesn't have any building. They don't have any money. What do you think? And he said, I think you should do it for a year. He said, you go down there and pastor for a year. He said, they'll beat you up, make life miserable for you. Then you can come back and you can farm, and we'll just be done with this church stuff. The only thing we ever fought about was how much time I invested in church up there, and Dad figured this would kind of get it out of my system, I guess. And I'd made this deal with God that whatever Dad said I'd do. So I was kind of stuck with it, and so I came down in 1976 to be the pastor here for 1 year, and the year drug on, went beyond a year, and things went fairly well for the first couple of years. I didn't know what I was doing. The first time, it was a couple of months after I started, somebody said, would you do a funeral? I forget the relative that died, and so I said, well, okay, I guess that's what I'm supposed to do. I called Bart Marshall in Salem. I said, Bart, I got to do a funeral, and I don't know how to do a funeral. I've only been to one in my life, and that was when I was a real little kid. He said, okay, and so I went to his office. He pulled out the paper, and he looked there to see, and he said, oh, here, they're having a funeral right now. Let's go, and we hopped in his car, and we went to this funeral. And we sat there, went through it was in a thing, and all the time he's telling me stuff, and I'm taking notes, and I said, okay. So I went back and did the funeral, and a little bit later, somebody wanted me to do a wedding, and I'd only been to 2 weddings. One of them was mine, and I only was half conscious through it. And so I called Bart. I said, Bart, I got to do this wedding. He said, and so I showed up at his office, and he looked in the paper, and sure enough, there was a wedding happening just a little bit. So we drove to this church where the wedding was going on, and we sat there, and he talked me through the thing, what they did. He said, I wouldn't do it that way. He just gave me some counsel and advice, and came back, did the wedding, and it's everything, first communion service, first business meeting, everything. I went and asked Bart what to do, and back then they required me to do 20 cold calls a week, and they would pay me $600 a month to Conservative Baptist. It was called Mission Aid. First year, $600, next year, $400, and the last year, $300. I think, I forget the exact numbers, but it was kind of that kind of. But in order to get the money, I had to send this piece of paper, and then I said I made these cold calls. Well, it just scared me to death. Absolutely petrified me to walk up and knock on a door with somebody I didn't know. And so I called Bart, and he said, oh, come up. And so we took off from his office and walked up the street, knocked on a door, and he did all the talking and walked on another street. And about the 4th or 5th house, he knocked on the door, and he said, hello, my name is Bart Marshall. I pastor the church down the street. This is my friend. He pastors in Jefferson, and he wants to talk to you. And we managed to get through that whole ordeal, but that's kind of how it began. Most everything I did I just didn't know what I was doing, and learned as we went along. Things went fairly well. Church grew. We bought this piece of property, got it a real steal on it because it was not approved for septic. And we thought, well, we'll never get to be past a church of 100, and we'll just put a storage tank in. Applied and got permission to do that. You just had to pump it out every 2 weeks. That was back when you could pump things out cheap, and so we put spigots on that would pop shut, and low-flow toilets and all that kind of stuff. We told people go to the bathroom before you come to church, and so we managed to buy the property, and we built the first building and moved in 1979. And we broke 100 people the first time when we did that, and we finally grew up to a church of about 200 after 5 years. And I thought I should probably write a book, and thought I was fairly successful.